This is the Pro Wrestling Illustrated podcast. I'm your host, PWI senior writer Al Castle, joined as always by my co-host, Brian Solomon.
Happy to be back with you again, Al, as always.
Yes, it's like twice in a week. I'm not sure when they're running this, but it's been relatively recent since we last spoke.
Don't get used to it.
But back together because we have a very special guest with us back on the show. Another wrestling magazine guy, I know, a good friend of yours, Brian, and a fellow author, Keith Elliot Greenberg. How's it going, Keith?
Hey, good to see you again, Al, even if it is remotely.
Yes, absolutely. And as I mentioned, Keith's got a new book. I think when we last had you on the podcast here, we were at the very beginning of the pandemic, and I think we talked a bit about how kind of surreal it was. And now, whatever it is, a couple years later, you wrote a whole book just on that subject. What's it called again?
It is called Follow the Buzzards, Pro Wrestling in the Age of COVID-19. And it is by ECW Press, which published my last book, Too Sweet, Inside the Indie Wrestling Revolution. And it's the same publisher that published Blood and Fire, Brian's classic.
That's right. And possibly my next book, which is still under wraps, but
yeah.
You guys are, it's just so impressive to me how you guys just crank these out. I mean, how much?
What do you expect me to do? Hang around with my family?
Right. It's overrated.
You got to work, I guess. Yeah. But I mean, when you're done with one of the, I guess this goes to either or both of you. When you're done with one of these, do you get hyped up to do the next one? Is it a bit of a a slog?
I was with this one. Because this is really a companion to my last book. My last book is about the indie wrestling revolution, and it ends basically with the first broadcast of AEW Dynamite. So there was a cliffhanger. It's like, okay, what's going to happen to indie wrestling now? I've given you the history to this point. Now what happens? Does WWE and AEW scoop up all the best indie talent and then the indies are dead? Does AEW last the first year? Does AEW make such an indent into WWE that WWE is buckling like never before? So it screamed for a sequel. And by the time I finished the epilogue, it was apparent that sequel was going to be about pro wrestling during the pandemic, because now we were going through a year that was beyond anything I think any of us have experienced. I mean, and that pro wrestling has experienced, although I wasn't around during the Spanish flu. So maybe pro wrestling experienced something similar at that time.
That really hurt Joe Stecker's marketability, I heard. Yeah.
Do they have a Thunderdome at the time?
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah, it was Earl Caddick and Joe Stecker in the Thunderdome. They hadn't even, which was wild because they hadn't even invented television yet, but they still had the screens up with everybody. It was amazing.
But they just had very primitive radio transmitters.
Right.
It's like analog screens.
Right. Yeah. Everyone's listening in on radio. Great.
Anyhow, we're going to talk about the book more in just a moment. I mean, it's a subject matter that is so interesting and comes up pretty frequently here when Brian and I talk about wrestling. But real quick, I want to get the plug out of the way. And us being on video, I think they're putting this on YouTube. I get to hold the prop. This is the PWI 500, the latest issue of Pro Wrestling Illustrated. You can get this over at PWI-online.com. Fair to say the biggest issue of the year is certainly up there. Lots of chatter about it. Don't miss out on getting yours. By all means, if you can find the news, do that.
Not joking. When I leave here, I'm actually going to buy it at the newsstand.
Yeah, I've got to actually buy myself an extra one because this was a first. Somebody asked me to sign one for them and give to them, so I'm going to go out of pocket and buy one and as a gift for someone. But two WWE magazine guys here. I'm interested. Keith, how long were you at the magazine?
The Ropes magazine. Two guys who also
That's right.
Inside the Ropes magazine.
How long were you at the WWE magazine again, Keith?
22 glorious years.
So some of that overlapped, I'm sure, with the PWI 500. Do you remember, was there any chatter over there about the 500
I mean,
and any thought of doing something similar?
Well, Brian was in the office. I was not. I was a freelancer and I was on retainer. So I would go to the arenas, but not. So I don't remember chatter in the office. I remember discussions among the people who enjoyed wrestling about the PWI 500 because everybody talks about the PWI 500. And
That's good to know.
especially the wrestlers. Like I can remember, it was probably last year or the year before, as Brian knows, by sheer circumstance, I was in high school at the same time as MJF's mother. And MJF was wrestling, I believe, John Moxley, who was PWI Wrestler of the Year. And on the PWI, was that last year or the year before?
I think he was number one on the 500, right? Was that it? Or was it Wrestler of the Year?
Moxley was.
Yes, that was maybe
2 years
so
ago.
it was it would have been 2 years ago, right? It was after his first year in AEW. Yeah.
But I remember MJF's mother posting something on Facebook, like, I can't believe it. Like, I remember like the PWI 500 coming to our house and putting it on Max's bed, school. And now he's wrestling the number one guy on the PWI 500. So that's what the PWI 500 means to these guys in the business now.
Yeah, I think it means the most, honestly, to the talent, to the wrestlers, because even like Keith was saying, I was in the office and, in the corporate side of things, they would always try to no sell all the other wrestling magazines and things. And, but the actual wrestlers, when you were on the road and when you were in locker rooms and stuff, they talked about still wrestling magazines, specifically PWI. I mean, they would talk about WOW at the time, but they talked about PWI and it meant something to them to get the awards and to get ranked on the 500, because I think, honestly, it's not a big breakthrough, but I think the wrestlers understood the business a lot more than the office people did very often. So
yeah. My quick MJF PWA 500 story. Come 500 time, we're looking. We want to make sure that we're really kind of tied into the independent scene and not missing any real standout indie talent that should be on the 500. And I've got a friend who trained locally here on Long Island. I remember asking her a few years back, is there anybody who's like coming up on the independent scene on Long Island that maybe should be somewhere on the list? And a friend of mine told me, this would have been maybe 2017, something like that. And she's there's this guy, Maxwell Jacob Friedman, who trains at my school, who you might want to keep your eye on. And, who knows? I mean, I wouldn't be surprised that if he tops this list one day. He's certainly in the mix. So
well, that was borne out by the promo on Dynamite between him and Regal.
That was quite a promo.
Yeah. I don't know how. I'm assuming most, if not all, of that was a shoot. I mean, I don't really know, but I mean, that says a lot about, kind of like how much it meant to him and how dedicated he was in those early years, before he got really discovered.
Yep.
I mean, is it all a shoot? I mean, I'm sure it's embellished, although I was just on a book tour in the UK and with the Inside the Ropes franchise. And, two of those days were a speaking tour that William Regal was doing. And he told that story that you heard on Dynamite about being 16 years old and getting beaten up by grown men and going to sleep crying and bleeding from everywhere in his body. So, that was not a work. That's for sure.
Yeah. There's some truth to it. So just to wrap up, again, go PWI-online.com. You can pick this up, subscribe, and you'll be sure not to miss two other ranking issues. One we put to bed recently, should be out relatively soon, the women's 150. And just this past week, we've been having some conversations. I know, Brian, you're part of the conversations about the what is now the tag team 100 list, which is on deck. Starting to put that together. It's starting to take shape. I think it's going to be very newsworthy. Don't miss any of them. Head on over to PWI-online.com. Keith, so let's talk pandemic. I think it again such an interesting time. Brian and I have talked a lot about how one of the things that is frustrating about WWE in the last 10 years plus is that it's looked the same for so long, right? I mean, if you pop in a Monday Night Raw from 2012, from a production value, it's indistinguishable from what exists today. And that's been the case for so long, but for one exception, and it is that pandemic period. And it is, I think, the one, year that maybe we go back to many years from now to check out some of those shows just because they were so weird. I mean, Monday Night Raw originally in the heck with Monday Night Raw, WrestleMania, in front of in an empty gym, essentially. And then for weeks in the Performance Center without fans, then a scattered few fans, then the Thunderdome era, so novel. And then AEW kind of had its own twist on things out of Jacksonville. They had some fans back, but it was this weird kind of vibe where it's just a few
Very
here
weird.
and a few there.
And if you recall, and this is all in the book, everything we're talking about is in the book. At one point, WWE they were doing matches in the Performance Center with trainees standing, not sitting, behind plexiglass.
Right. And they had to wear masks, and some got scolded, I remember, for not wearing masks.
Yeah, and it was dark in there, and it was just so otherworldly. And it's so easy to forget this is the recent past, but it's almost like for all of us, there's an edit, a mental edit during that period. And I brought this up in another interview I did. I was recently talking to a woman I know in Los Angeles who got pregnant and had a child during COVID-19. And now she gets together with old friends, and it's almost like she never gave birth, because it's like we went back to 2019 and it's almost like we've edited out the in-between part.
Right. Like hitting a pause button on life,
Yeah. But there's already, in some ways, I feel, just speaking for myself, a little nostalgia. I
hope so.
I logged into some of those Thunderdome shows because my kids got a kick out of it, and you'd stand in front of your laptop and you'd wait to see if you could see your face on Raw, and a couple times we did, and you'd have to, we'd press pause on the DVR and scan every screen in the arena to see if one of them was us. It's such a weird, bizarre time, something that hopefully we never have to go through again. So that's from a production standpoint, but I also think it's really interesting. And let's talk about WWE for a moment, what it did to the product. And I think there were some pros and some cons, but I think by and large, when I think about the worst WWE product in the last 20 years, I think it's that pandemic year from a creative standpoint. And I wonder if it's just a matter of not having that, having an audience there, that kind of like nightly.
Now you're not calculating in the two cinematic matches at WrestleMania 36.
There were some good. Absolutely, there was some good. Another one that I point out as a pro was the Edge Randy Orton greatest match in the history of the world.
Right.
And which was very good, and it was
because that was not unlike.
It was post-produced.
The boiler room brawl. There had been cinematic matches in the past, as I point out in the book, but now we were dependent on cinematic matches.
I think it's.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, please.
No, if we hadn't had the cinematic match in matches at WrestleMania 36, which, and I say this in every interview, criticize WWE creative all you want during that period. But Vince McMahon had a green light those two matches. And one was like, as I always say, one was like John Wayne in True Grit, and one was like Eraserhead. So you had two very different types of cinematic matches. And without that, you would not have had Stadium Stampede, which honestly, I remember extremely fondly, that first Stadium Stampede. And that's a match I would gleefully watch again.
That was one of the. I'm sorry, go ahead, Brian.
No, I was just going to say one thing, and I'd love to hear what you guys think of this, or maybe I'm off base, but we used to talk about, Al, that I always assumed that that the whole cinematic match thing had gotten so much traction that it would be a regular continued thing even after the pandemic. And I don't think that's really happened. Like, I expected it to be much more of a thing now. I kind of thought like, well, we're, for better or worse, we're stuck with these things now because people like them, but they've kind of gone away. Am I wrong?
Right, because there's not a necessity for it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And it takes a lot of work, right? I mean, that's the other part of it, is just from a production standpoint. It's extra effort versus being in an arena. The ring is set up there. Let's just do it in there.
I'm good friends with some of the makeup and costume and design people at WWE still, and they were telling me what an incredible pain in the behind it was to do. I think they were talking about the Undertaker. It might have been the Undertaker AJ Styles one, of just like they're dressing the set like they're making a movie and all this stuff, and they're just like,
we're making a movie,
and they're going, God.
Cutaways. I mean.
Right,
when
they were making a movie.
Was thrown off the roof. It was like watching a horror movie. It's like he literally didn't have to be thrown off a roof for a change.
Yeah, right. And I didn't like that match.
Also had the Money in the Bank match where it appeared that Baron Corbin threw two people to their deaths.
Right. I thought Rey Mysterio would have been out on the post road in front of 1241
at the beer distributor.
Yeah, I thought he'd be at the beverage barn or something. Right.
But I mean, I was slow to come around on some of this, and I remember watching the Undertaker AJ Styles match. My first reaction was negative. But then I did come around on it, and now again, looking back with some hindsight, you really do appreciate the innovation that came out, and this goes for all kinds of the fact that we're doing this on Zoom was an innovation that came out of the pandemic.
Thinking about that, now, like, look at the world of podcasting, how that's been transformed, and that's why this book isn't only about professional wrestling. It's about the rest of the world. Like, I've had some criticism, like, why did you have to mention Brexit? Why did you have to mention, Trump? Because that was happening. Everything was mixed together during that period. We couldn't distinguish between what was wrestling and what was real life.
You've got Bray Wyatt on the cover, right? I mean, that's the Fiend on the cover of the book.
It's not. You may interpret it as Bray Wyatt.
It is okay. Fair enough.
I mean, I don't see any trademark on this over here.
It's somebody with a mask on. But I do think it in some ways it's kind of the perfect figure to analyze as far as yes, because of the whole cinematic overtones. And again, when I think of the worst of pandemic era wrestling, I think of Bray Wyatt, and I don't mean this, I guess in some ways I do, as a slight on him, but it is like you can take this stuff too far, and in the absence of again that nightly focus group that is a live crowd, I think they went too far with some of this stuff, and you had Bray Wyatt being set on fire in the middle of the ring, and Seth Rollins plucking Rey Mysterio's eyeball out.
Right. And think about those angles. Like, these are all the result of there not being live fans. And also, they had the luxury of, reshooting things. Like, apparently in the first take in the Eye for an Eye match, there was an orb that dislodged.
The damn eye didn't come out.
and then the decision was made. Nah, that's going a little too far. Let's just have Seth Rollins vomit instead.
And there had to be things that were done that I don't think would have gone over with a live crowd. I think there were certain things, and in some ways that's a good thing because it gives you a little breathing room to try things out. But in some ways, I think it's like it's kind of it gives you some false sense of, I don't know, because I feel like, for example, as interesting and fascinating and different as the Funhouse match was with John Cena and Bray Wyatt. You know, it was weird and bizarre, and I didn't know what I was watching when I first saw it. I think that if they had tried that in a live room and like put it on the Titantron or whatever,
Right,
I just think that
Titantron in a massive football stadium.
they would have, but I think they would have lost that crowd. I think the crowd would have just been like, "What are we sitting here watching?"
Sitting there watching a half-hour movie,
right? I think it plays better on TV than it would have if it was with an audience.
Right.
Well, if you remember, the first live show after the pandemic or during the pandemic was WrestleMania last year, 37 in Tampa, and I was there. And I think night 2 opened with Bray Wyatt and Randy Orton, and this was after Bray Wyatt was burned alive in the ring. And it was the first time that this angle was put in front of live fans, and they rejected it completely. I mean, it was booed out of the building, and I think we never saw Bray Wyatt again.
This is in the book. I described being at that WrestleMania. We were both in the press box, I believe, you and I, right?
No, I think I was just among the fans. Yeah.
Okay. But I was in the press box the first night from my vantage point, and I kept going into the stands to gauge the crowd and speak to people in the crowd. And the first night, people were so exhilarated that live wrestling was back. And that they were sitting with other people
soaking wet,
and they were sitting with live fans at a WrestleMania that WWE couldn't really do much wrong.
Yeah.
The second night, you'd already sat through a night of WrestleMania. So when that first match, Bray Wyatt and and Randy Orton came up, and there was the bizarre ending where Alexa Bliss is like sitting on the Jack in the Box.
Right, there's a big Jack in the Box
coming down her face, and it's like, okay, WWE is back. Boo, boo, boo.
Yeah. But do you think that Vince McMahon learned a lesson out of that? Did after they got fans back in the building, did he realize that maybe he took things too far? He's got plenty of free time these days to take your call.
Right.
But do you think he realized he pushed things too far?
Well, I don't know. I don't know if Vince McMahon learned or didn't learn. I don't. I think they were just trying to see what worked, as did AEW. And look, let's remember that dance routine with Chris Jericho and MJF.
Right. God, so much weird stuff.
Would that go over now? I don't know.
That got written up in the New York Times. Do you guys remember that? Where they were like talking about one of the highlights of the year or something?
Because again, they were talking about theatrical highlights of the year when Broadway was shuttered.
Right.
So again, this is where the real world and the wrestling world all came together, where the New York Times theater critic, they're watching wrestling because what else is on? Week after week, that's fresh.
Do you think fans gave wrestling more rope because of this? And it's already this bizarre, outlandish world, but were they more tolerant to some of this experimenting, understanding that there were so many limitations?
Yes. As a fan, I was appreciative that these people were giving me a product to watch. Mm-hmm. And they were giving me the one product that I love. As opposed to like having to learn. And had there been, let's say, if the only sport in the world that was broadcast live was cricket at the time, I probably would have started following cricket, at least for that period. But it was wrestling, the thing I've been watching since I'm 3 years old.
Yeah. How much in the book do you discuss precautions taken? I mean, the other side of this is week in, week out, there were concerns about wrestlers, about fans, and I think we talked about it. It might be the most uniquely, I don't know if dangerous is the word, but it's impossible to be a pro wrestler and take these precautions, right? I mean, you are in your underwear rolling around with another individual face to face. You can put a mask on if you want. It's not going to make that much of a difference.
It's not going to make that much of a difference because you're also, touching each other and spraying germs. If you remember, you were supposed to swab down surfaces with disinfectant. Yeah. I remember being on an airplane before the vaccine was out. And the person I was with, pulled out sanitizer and was like scrubbing down the trays in front of us.
My wife was wiping down the groceries. So
yeah, the Amazon boxes.
Remember that? I knew a lot of people. Like a friend of mine, was in remission from cancer, and he was getting groceries delivered to his house, and then he would have them leave it in the hallway, and then he would like spray it all down and leave it out there before he brought the groceries inside. And I guess he wasn't worried about anybody stealing it in his apartment building because no one wanted to touch it because they didn't know it was infected. Think about
much did you get
that all was.
Yeah, absolutely. And for us and for wrestling companies, again, there's a whole other level of complication. What was your sense, and I guess talking about WWE for the moment, about how seriously they took precautions during the height of the pandemic?
I mean, that's in the book. I mean, WWE thought they were taking, the most stringent precautions in sports. I quote Triple H talking about zapping the performance center with ultraviolet light at night to, pierce the virus. They had some biochemical company that sold them that this is the one thing that will protect the people at the performance center. And are you going to say, well, nobody gets work like a worker? Or are you saying, hey, they were just trying to be safe? No one knew any better.
Yeah. And even with those precautions, people got COVID, obviously, and there was an effect on the product. I guess the most notable being Roman Reigns not wrestling on WrestleMania that year. And he didn't get it, at least at the time, but he took the precautions. From your work on the book, what was sort of the and not to give anything away, but what were some of the more scarier moments? What were some of the more scarier moments, maybe touch and go, as far as a wrestler health?
Well, I'm going to say, and this is something I chronicle because I kept in touch throughout the pandemic with Brett Lauderdale, the promoter for, Game Changer Wrestling, GCW. And the first collective that he was supposed to do, the collective is their shows. They bring all these indie promotions together, usually on WrestleMania weekend, and they're in one location. And they had to cancel the collective the week of WrestleMania 36. So in October of 2020, he decides to do a collective in Indianapolis at the state fairgrounds. And all these indie promotions, primarily from the Midwest, they come out there. Most of the guys drive. Most of the fans have driven. A few flew. I flew, but I was there I was actually there to sell my last book at the merch table. And it was in an agricultural building with giant barn doors. So the doors were open. We were indoors, but the doors were wide open. The wind could come in. There were giant fans, like larger than a human being, whirring at the time. So, it was supposed to like keep the bad air out. And everybody was required to wear masks. At one point, like I was having a drink of something, and then I kept the mask down, and a woman came over and she's like, put the mask back up. And then right after that, there was a report that 3 of the wrestlers had come down with COVID, and realized there's no vaccine yet. So 3 wrestlers coming down with COVID is a frightening prospect. Is this person going to end up in the hospital? Is this person going to end up on a ventilator? Is this person going to die? And then I was talking to Brett, and it's in the book, and he's like, oh my God, like he's checking his phone every minute. How many more people are going to come down with COVID? Like, is this going to be a super spreader event? Is GCW going to be out of business? Are people who went to my show going to die? And he's waiting for that shoe to fall, but nothing more happens. And those particular wrestlers recover. And, in hindsight, did they get it at the collective? Did they have it the day before the collective?
Yes, no way to know.
It was not the crisis that he feared it would be. But when you put yourself in the shoes of an indie promoter with not a large budget, that can ruin everything you've worked for.
And even some with some budgets were irreparably harmed. I mean, a Ring of Honor effectively went out of business. I mean, they were resurrected by Tony Khan, but I think you could trace.
After Tony Khan, look, if it wasn't for Tony Khan, they probably would not have gone out of business. But when Cody and the Bucks and Kenny jumped ship, that was the people who were drawing a lot of the fans to Ring of Honor.
But Ring of Honor was real. I mean, and it in some ways, it's sort of like no good deed goes unpunished, that they got praise for maybe taking the pandemic the most seriously. And they kind of followed the NBA bubble model, where they kept their wrestlers in hotel rooms for the duration of their TV tapings. And they were just out, not running shows for many, many months. This is after they came back on. And ultimately, I think they ran out of money, right? I mean, it sounds like that's effectively what happened with them.
And I think they've always worked on a strict budget anyway. So, it's not like the difference between Tony Khan and Sinclair Broadcasting is, Sinclair Broadcasting is not going to spend the kind of money that Tony Khan is going to spend.
Yeah.
So, there was a budget and you couldn't go much beyond the budget. That said, they paid the wrestlers, they paid the staff during that period. There's a lot to celebrate for that period. But ultimately, they went out of business. And if you recall, once WWE and AEW and the other indies, including New Japan, were doing shows in front of live crowds again, even if those crowds were socially distanced, Ring of Honor was still doing shows in empty arenas. And now it felt like you were watching wrestling 12 months earlier. And who the hell wanted to be bummed out by that?
Right. It was sort of just a reminder, just a downer in a way. It's kind of like those New Japan shows where they wouldn't allow people to cheer or make noise.
Well, I think is that still in place? I think maybe.
I'm not so sure they've lifted that yet.
They've lifted it for some and not others, which I have no idea why. Like, there was a big deal a couple of weeks ago where it was like, oh my God, it's the first show where we can cheer. And then I saw recently, maybe they had an outbreak where
they said, no, stop that cheering.
Yeah, no, they did. They had another show where it's like, okay, you can't cheer. Now you can cheer. Now you can't. It's just odd.
Didn't they give them like buttons or something that would cheer for them or something? I
think there was some electronic device where you
maybe they could snap like the kids on college campuses do, instead of yelling.
But I think there was something you could control, like cheer, boo, neutral.
Yeah, that was another
great. This is awesome.
Right. You effed up. Yeah.
But that was one of the revelations, and maybe not a revelation, but how important crowd noise is. And we've sat through, even before or after the pandemic, the match that a crowd is dead for, and it makes all the difference. Sometimes the work in the ring, everything is just banging, right, on all cylinders, but the lack of enthusiasm from a crowd will kill it. We've seen that in WrestleMania main events. And here, night in, night out, even the best of matches were playing to silence until, there was this wake up of, well, maybe we just pump in fake noise. And certainly WWE started doing that. I know Impact did that. What was your take on that, Keith, using fake noise?
Well, initially, there was a lot of criticism of the can noise. And I can't remember which podcast I was on, because I was promoting Too Sweet inside the indie wrestling revolution in the midst of the pandemic. So someone had me on a podcast, and they said, I liked it, but it was like the first Thunderdome pay-per-view had been shown. I liked it, but you could tell that noise was so canned. And I said, look, if having done work for Vince McMahon for many years, and Brian knows this, if we're talking about it, the people at WWE were talking about it, and they were refining that audio as we spoke. Now, towards the end, I did not feel, now maybe I was suspending my disbelief. I did not feel like the noise was canned. It suddenly didn't sound canned to me anymore. I gave in to the Thunderdome.
Yeah. It certainly was canned, but I do think they got better about making it more organic. And the other reality is that, I'll pop in an old WWF Superstars tape from the 80s or 90s. They've always been doing that, right? I mean, canned noise at wrestling shows is old.
When I was doing, the Freddie Blassie book back in like 2002, I went over to Japan, and Shun Yamaguchi, who was then a photographer, but later he was one of the Japanese, WWE Japanese language announcers. He and I went to Killer Khan's restaurant in the red light district in Tokyo. And, I told him, and he didn't know this, that for years there was a tape of Hogan against Killer Khan in Madison Square Garden. And for some reason, there was like immense cheering. And every time a match needed to be sweetened up on, WWE show, they went to that tape and they inserted some of that noise. And
I didn't know that's where it came from.
Yeah, and Killer Khan was quite gratified to hear that.
Wow. I didn't know it came from that specifically. I remember that. I almost went to that, man.
That came to me from somebody who worked in the TV studio, and I don't think he would have randomly picked that particular match.
Right. It sort of went out of style. That's the thing. It was a big thing to sweeten the audio, like back in the days of the Superstars and Challenge tapings for the weekend. There was a lot of sweetened audio. And then I think maybe in the live Monday Night Raw era, it just fell out. It became
Monday Night Raw, and you know this because you were at the first Monday Night Raw.
Well, you didn't need it. You didn't need it.
You didn't need it because it was very intimate, and everybody there was like you. Everybody there was a hardcore. And so you certainly didn't need to sweeten the sound. It was small. And so everybody there was a hardcore. So that was going to reverberate, and you could feel that.
The one time I think that they really overdid it in an unnecessary way with that during the pandemic was when they did the Hall of Fame. I felt like doing the Hall of Fame in an empty arena where there's no fans there, and I don't even think they had the screens on, although maybe they did, and you're hearing all these weird fake reactions to people's Hall of Fame speeches. And they're all very
that's
scripted
in the book too. Like Scott Hall was telling me about it. Davey Boy Smith Jr. was telling me about it. And they were talking about, you get up there and you're making your speech, and then you're told pause. So it's like, and I want to compliment all the people we worked with. And
that was so terrible, that Hall of Fame.
And you pause, cheer, cheer. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, who else would the Steiner brothers?
I think that would have been the time to kind of pivot and say, this one time we're going to do it like banquet style instead of, like they used to do it. Like, forget about the audience.
It was a lot of fun.
Just have a banquet with the wrestlers and company people in an intimate setting.
Do it outdoors
with safety precautions. Do it like that, just this one time, rather than I felt like they just were trying to force it. Like, we're going to do it our way. And that's
kind of shoehorn 2 Hall of Fames into.
I forgot. That's right. They did.
Taping.
Oh, that's extra awful.
And they were limited in their time. Like, they could only talk for like 3 minutes at a time. There was a lot they were trying to get done because they were behind. They were like a year behind on the Hall of Fame.
And because they could control the fans' reactions, I think they felt that much more emboldened to script everything that was said, because and you remember, like, Eric Bischoff, everything was so clearly scripted word for word, but you got the reaction you wanted.
But Scott Hall said he wasn't scripted. He said he was told to confine his speech to like 3 minutes, and he said, I know how to cut a promo, so I gave him my best 3-minute promo.
Yeah. The flip side of this, and the other thing I'm remembering talking about this about the Thunderdome was, it wasn't just that the sound was canned, but it was the first time that fans were produced. So if you were in the Thunderdome, right, you'd be watching the feed, and you'd have audio coming in from a producer, and he would say, Edge is coming out in 5 seconds. Let's everybody get, those signs up. Everybody, we want to see you applauding big. And then it was like the equivalent of the applause signs on Saturday Night Live.
Did you ordered that? You participated in the Thunder?
I did, yeah, more than once, yeah. So it was fascinating.
Would they say cheer for Edge?
Yes, exactly. Yes, they would. Everybody get up when they'd be counting down, come back from commercial. They'd get everybody hyped up. So and so is coming up. Let's cheer for them. I think they had you boo the heels. It's so fascinating.
Thumbs down, as I remember. Looking at the screen, there were a lot of people with thumbs. And
there was even controversy around this. Did you remember? I'm just remembering some of this stuff that because you couldn't control, what people did from home. I remember somebody was. Did they have a Chris Benoit cardboard cutout? I think
somebody put up some white supremacist symbol, and WWE declared these people are banned for life. I mean, are they? I mean,
what a weird time. Yeah. It's funny that it already feels like, such an ancient history. And we were just living through this. The other thing I wanted to
look, and what I'm hoping is, 20 years from now, someone looks at this and it's like, wow, what a snapshot of a time. Now,
yes, it's a great idea for a book just because of that. Yeah.
20 years from now, somebody could say, who the hell wants to read this? But I'm hoping that, for nostalgia's sake, it's like now you look at wrestlers who were, mid-card guys, but in hindsight, now there's a certain cult allure that they have. I'm hoping the same holds true for the pandemic era.
Do you think there are wrestlers whose careers were made because of the pandemic?
I mean, there were certainly wrestlers whose careers were made during the pandemic era. I mean, especially in AEW. I mean, now, but again, is that because of the pandemic, or is it because of Tony Khan? Or is it because of them? Like Darby Allin. I had seen Darby Allin on the indies. Darby Allin was pretty exciting. Jungle Boy and, MJF naturally, Sammy Guevara, but would those guys' careers have been elevated regardless of the pandemic or not? What about you? What do you think now?
The one that came to mind was Eddie Kingston. And, without a live audience, kind of determining whether something is over or not over, it's sort of left to the fans at home watching on TV to make their own call. And I don't know that Eddie Kingston gets over as well as he did under normal times, but
he's a great promo.
Oh, I think it was totally well-deserved. I think it's one of the great stories of the pandemic.
And unless he was telling great stories. And, and this was the first time a lot of people were exposed to Eddie Kingston.
I think somebody who definitely got more of an opportunity than he would have gotten was Drew McIntyre, because,
or do you, I feel a little sorry for Drew McIntyre.
I do too.
Yeah. The WrestleMania moment was taped. I mean, in the book, I quote him saying that, he didn't even accept that he'd won the title until he watched it on TV with his wife. And then he's like, wow, I guess I really am the champ.
It's so weird. Yeah.
It was weird for him. But I think what happened with him was that, it was like this experiment to see, is this guy going to work as our top guy? Let's give it a shot. And I feel like once they went back to live crowds, I think his push died, because I almost that was the verdict. Like, we don't want this guy.
I wrote about this both in the book, and I wrote about this in Inside the Ropes magazine of WrestleMania 36. I was very curious to see the reaction to Drew McIntyre now that there were live fans there. And again, it was WrestleMania, so fans were hyped up anyway. And he was in the first match with Bobby Lashley, and
really good match.
Yeah, it was a good match. It was, two big bulls just colliding. That's the kind of match it was marketed as. It lived up to expectations. And, I felt the fans gave him a pretty big cheer. Now, had he been on after we'd already been sitting in the arena in the stadium for 5 hours, maybe he wouldn't have gotten as big of a cheer. But I felt that there was a connection that the fans were feeling with him.
Yeah, I've called him the man who built the Thunderdome. He had 2 world title reigns and never wrestled for the title or defended the title in front of live fans. Yeah, I mean, just crazy. Well, I guess he challenged for it at WrestleMania, but he never wrestled as world champion in front of live fans in a year. So incredible. The other thing that, again, I think about a lot is that match, Randy Orton and Edge, that was hyped as the greatest match of all time. And certainly wasn't, but was a really good match. And the thing that I took away from it was there's absolutely something to be said for the value and the benefits of post-production and what you can do with a match when you can do like any other media does, do several takes, right? And I think one of them ended up getting hurt pretty seriously, right? Because they shot a bump several times. Yeah, Edge got hurt because they kept on reshooting something over and over again until they got it the way they wanted it.
But yes, I agree with you.
But it was a match in a laboratory setting, and it's so fascinating doing something like that because wrestling by its nature is so kind of improvisational. And here it was again, they were able to put it together exactly. Yeah, they were able to put it together exactly the way they wanted to.
Right. And and I bring this up too in the book. Then because I took this all the way. Basically, the book goes from January 1st, 2020 to January 1st, 2022. Although, I add some things to put it in context. And I say that it's the only professional wrestling book ever that includes 2 WrestleManias, 2 Royal Rumbles, 2 Wrestle Kingdoms, and 2 U.S. presidential impeachments. But
well said.
About that match with the explosive barbed wire match.
Oh, yeah, it's another one. Yeah,
and so that's Omega. That was Omega and Moxley.
Yeah.
Yes, with Kingston running in. Yeah,
with Kingston running in, and now we're coming out of the deep lockdown pandemic era. So it is at Daly's place, and there are fans, like real fans, in the building. Again, they're socially distanced, but they're real people there now. So you can't retape stuff, and then it's a botch. Kingston comes in, the fireworks look like sparklers going off. The explosions look like sparklers going off, and people are complaining. But like a few weeks earlier, there were no fans in the building, and we were complaining that we were losing the spontaneous experience. And now fans are coming back, and we're coming out of the pandemic era, and we're complaining about that.
And think about if they did much more than they did, and they've got a big plume of smoke, and everybody's coughing all over each other in the middle of a pandemic. That wouldn't have been so great either. Right,
but had it been 6 months earlier, they just would have reshot it.
Yeah, fascinating.
What was never would have known about the botch.
What do you think? It's something that's obvious, but maybe not so much. What was the key difference in how AEW and WWE approached the pandemic?
Well, I mean, the most obvious one would have been, AEW, in my opinion, successfully recreated a studio wrestling feel by having the talent spread out among ringside and really acting as fans. And I really felt they were reacting as fans, and they were truly having fun. They weren't told what to say or how to act. And then WWE developed the Thunderdome, which, made a bigger splash than having just some wrestlers spread at ringside. And again, that's something that seemed to be revolutionary. And at the time, and this is all in the book, I remember thinking like, wow, this Thunderdome is so good. Yeah. I'm sure they'll find a use for it after this is all over. But of course, why would you have something in a Thunderdome now?
Yeah. You know, what's interesting also about the Thunderdome is that because they have all these other B shows, whether it was at the time 205 Live or Main Event. And for those, they just took footage of fans from Raw and SmackDown and just kind of repurposed it for all these other shows. So there were no live fans essentially for that. But my other, takeaway about AEW's model is that, we talked about how wrestling doesn't work in silence, but the difference between having nobody there and having just a few people there was huge. I mean, just even a few people to applaud, to pop for moves, a smattering of applause went a long way.
Right. And, I want to point out that, this book isn't just an AEW or WWE book. So we have things in this book like the social distancing match that between Jimmy Lloyd and Joey Janela that was done in an empty arena for GCW, where they had to stay 6 feet apart. And, one guy would hip toss the other and the other would sell it from across the ring. And Chris Levin, the referee, had a tape measure, and then you had other things like I'm looking at this here. This is the promotion in Finland, and where they were in an oil silo. So it's very creative for a small promotion in Finland. They know they can have live crowds, but they have a match inside an oil silo. And so there's this really cool and eerie echo, and there's darkness, and it works. And then, the promotion Fist in San Diego, small promotion, they were having drive-in shows. So, there were a lot of small promotions that managed to survive and get around the pandemic, and they all deserve credit for their ingenuity.
Yeah. I mean, there was so much innovation that came out of it, and you mentioned the drive-in shows. I remember going to some drive-in local concerts that summer in 2020, and they were so cool. To me, that was like the way to go to local concerts going forward. It's basically combining the tailgate experience and the concert itself, and you've got
outside the car and
and fans would honk the horn for the band and stuff as kind of an applause.
Were like honking the horn for the baby face at these drive-in shows. And I can remember, there were also drive-in movies that people.
Yeah, that came back. Yeah.
Came back. Yeah.
What are some ways that you think or some lessons that wrestling got from the pandemic that have stuck around and that we still see now?
Well, when I was on the Busted Open radio show discussing this with some of the hosts, Mickey James said because she couldn't rely on the crowd to inform what she was doing in the ring, she reverted back to just really cool wrestling moves. And she feels that that's carried over to the present day, that, without having the fans there, in some ways, there was a movement back to wrestling. Not that it's the wrestling that you would have seen in the Hackenschmidt and Gotch days, but there was a move to, it's a wrestling show. Show them wrestling.
Yeah, that's a good point. I remember talking to Bailey, or I think it was Bailey, and making kind of the opposite point that, without worrying about the fans' approval, you could just kind of go out there and do what you want. And that's where her, talking about wrestlers that really maybe had the careers made from the pandemic. Bailey might be another one. But it was like removing this pressure from wrestlers to pop a live crowd, right? And then it's just like, follow your instincts.
Like The Miz, the first broadcast of, WWE in the Performance Center, The Miz was saying, like, even though there are no people here, Orlando, Florida is still a hellhole. And Jericho came on AEW and he said, after what happened last week, I don't care what's going on in the world. fans are banned from AEW. So there was some humor in playing off of what was going on in the world, except for one thing. And I point this out. Neither WWE nor AEW ever said the two words Donald Trump during that entire period.
Yeah,
that's true.
Or since, I think. I mean, have we heard it since?
Yeah, they don't talk about Putin anymore. You remember when they would always
Of course, I think about it all the time.
They would put Putin up on the screen to get heat on
Rusev.
What the heck? Rusev, right.
Yeah.
And that would be unthinkable now to do.
Oh, now? Yeah, of course. Well, now
unthinkable.
It would be funny.
Right. But also you polarize your audience now because a portion of these nut jobs think he's a great guy. So you want to retain those fans too.
Right. Well, that's the whole thing about not saying Donald Trump's name. You'd alienate half the audience.
Right.
Although one fan on Amazon said, I alienated half of the wrestling community by mentioning Trump. So, what are you going to do? I made my decision and I stand by it.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating time. I think it's such a cool subject matter for a book. I remember, for years I'd go to wrestling shows like in the Westchester County Center. It's so small. And I'd always sort of think almost comically, can you imagine if they tried doing a WrestleMania here, how ridiculous that would look? And we got something more ridiculous than that in WrestleMania, whatever it was, 36. One thing that's always made me feel bad about that, and maybe the guy, and I've met him, I forget his name, but he went to every WrestleMania up until that one.
You're talking about Vladimir or Charlie? Charlie,
yeah. Yeah, it's Charlie. Yeah, and I got to talk to him about this, and I think he told me that there was even some discussion of making it work, whether they could get him in the building for that. I think they would have had to hire him or something.
And you know what? It's interesting. Brian has seen this. There is the McMahon family definitely cherishes their longtime fans. And I could have seen, Charlie Adorno being given a day job just so he could see.
Yeah, it sort of broke my heart that he couldn't be there. And I think there were a handful of people who were there. I mean, I think, was it Jim Ross? Jim Ross went to a UFC show that nobody was at. But I imagine some folks were in that building. And that is the ultimate, a fan, story, right? I was at the WrestleMania that nobody was at.
Like WrestleMania took place on one day, like they were shooting.
Right, sure, yeah.
They were shooting.
But if you could have been in the building for one of the matches,
it's like, okay, Drew McIntyre's in the building.
A pre-taped WrestleMania.
What are the plans for the next month for Drew McIntyre?
Yeah.
We're doing all of Drew McIntyre's matches now while we have him here because we're trying to be safe. And then we get him out and we bring in, AJ Styles.
Right. Remember, Drew's first defense was against the Big Show 5 minutes after he won the title from Brock Lesnar. Yeah, I mean, they brought him right out and they did a match, I think was for Raw. So, yes, absolutely bizarre. Anyway, again, I think a super interesting topic for a book. Where can fans get it?
Okay, well, as I've pointed out, Follow the Buzzards Pro Wrestling in the Age of COVID-19 can be purchased anywhere you purchase books. Like I said in another interview, it's not like you have to go to the dark web to find it. It's ECW Press. It's on Amazon. If you walk into a bookstore, a community bookstore, or a chain, it will likely be there. It starts selling in stores in the UK and in Ireland starting in November. So most fans watching here, they can procure it.
You talk about, changes coming out of the pandemic. One that I recently read is more bookstores are popping up. So Barnes and Nobles is opening a bunch more brick and mortar bookstores on Long Island, where I am, because reading took off during the pandemic. So they were selling more books.
Did reading take off on Long Island, or did
Long Islanders learned to read during the let's alienate some more fans.
See, I'm surprised to hear that. I really am, honestly, because to me, this is my own editorial. The pandemic and everything I saw online and the rise of TikTok and everything and all that happened during the pandemic, it proved to me the lengths that people will go to avoid reading at all costs.
Even when you have nothing else to do.
Right, when you have nothing else to do, I will find things to do.
I'm going to rearrange my closet. Yeah.
So but what you're saying is encouraging, because maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I was wrong.
Some people did pick up a book. I was not one.
I was just at the Wrestling Universe in Queens selling my book on Saturday. And look, that was easy for me because I grew up in that neighborhood. So I'd say, at least 10 of the books that were sold to people who went to PS 209 with me. So I'm not sure if those really count as official books.
Awesome.
But the way I would get, like, if someone was there with a kid, the way I'd get them to buy a book is I'd say to the kid, you look like a very literate young lady. And invariably, parents would buy her a book.
It's a good trick. All right, Keith, thank you so much. Brian, you want to mention you have something you can hold up? I'll hold up the PWI 500. Do you have a book to hold up?
I don't want to do no. I can save my book plug on this one. This is about Keith's book. We'll plug my book again on the next one. I do that every week.
You already wrote a better book than me.
No.
As I said, you were at my book party and I announced it to everybody. I said, this is Brian Solomon. If it wasn't for Brian Solomon, I would have written the best wrestling book of 2022. Now I've written the second best wrestling.
And we're both going to lose the Observer Book of the Year award to Brian DeWart. So we have that in common, right?
But he'll pay in the end.
Right.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both so much. As always, Keith in particular, a pleasure to have you on, and hopefully we'll do it again. I'm sure you're going to have another book before long, and we'll have you back on.
Thank you.
All right, guys. Thanks so much. We'll do it again soon. Take care.
Up your kid, Brian.
Yeah, it's got to go do that. Bye, guys.